Close your eyes if you like. Let your breath slow, settle into the quiet cadence of the room you are in, the small noises, the hush between heartbeats. Imagine for a while that you are not here at all but elsewhere, drifting on a tide of light between the stars, cradled in a vast and ancient silence. The galaxy rolls by like a slow sea. In that sea there are islands of brilliance, cities like gems, ships like lichened whales, gardens strung along the bones of dying suns. And among those islands, shining like a memory of a dream, there are the worlds of the Eldar. Picture them, not merely cities but living sculptures, entire continents folded into patterns of grace. Their architecture moves with a purpose that feels older than language. Towers curve like the arc of a bow, streets sweep like a single drawn breath. Gardens hang suspended in air, each leaf a measured note in a music of living geometry. Light on an Eldar avenue is never harsh. It pools and glances, sliding along surfaces finished to a polish so fine that the sky itself seems to smile back. Walkways glide soundlessly beneath your feet. The air is cool and scented with 1,000 cultivars, night fruits that taste of summer and rain, flowers whose fragrance sings of memory rather than of the present. This is a civilization that treats beauty like a covenant. There is a softness here, but not weakness. The Eldar carry themselves with a sovereign calm, the long, contained breath of a species in command of both craft and will. Their armor and garments are woven with filaments that catch the light and tell the story of 1,000 wars without shouting. Instruments hang at their sides, ivory rods and crystal lenses, tools of craft and mind. When they move, it is an economy of motion, precise and effortless, as if the body remembers futures it has not yet lived. Hear their music. It is not the clumsy beating of drums but a close, intimate sound, like wind through an organ whose pipes are made of living bone. Harps play in frequencies that stir the edges of thought. Singers breathe notes that fold with the mind like silk. Much of their language is sung, a litany of vowels and pauses that shift perception as much as meaning. The air itself vibrates under such songs, and those who listen carefully say that the music remembers them, a dangerous, wonderful thing. At the heart of their cities are the shrines to seership and grace, temples shaped like the inner curve of a hand. Inside these, the farseers sit in quiet, their gaze folded inward as if listening to the weave of the world itself. Their minds are sharp, honed on threads of possibility. They read time as a pattern, and from those patterns they pull answers like threads from a tapestry. They will tell you, softly and without fuss, that the future is not fixed. It is a place of many doors, and to slip through one is simply to become the person who already did. There is a faith here too, but it is not the thunder of dogma. It is a devotion to form, to balance, to the act of keeping an immense thing in motion without tearing. The Eldar reverence for art and craft and ritual is a quiet thing. It takes place in hand-bent bronze, in the careful tending of a single rare tree on a terrace where the world below forgets the sound of rain. They have a long memory for small kindnesses. They make altars to mornings, to the exact way sunlight arrives on a particular plaza. They measure time by the opening of flowers. This world, these worlds, are old as memory. They predate empires whose names have turned to glossed myth. Their ships arc through the void like gentle comets, painted with runes that look like music. The Craftworlds themselves drift along ordained paths, each a self-contained galaxy of art, life, thought. They are cultures of restraint, of craft, and of a terrible sophistication. Where lesser species speak of victory and loss with blunt words, the Eldar understand nuance in the space between breaths. And yet, even within this refinement, there are edges. Beauty, when cut too precisely, can sting. Perfection, observed without interruption, will eventually notice its own reflection until the reflection begins to look back. You will hear sometimes a softness of sorrow threaded through their songs, an ache like a string under tension. They have always known what loss is. 1,000 migrations have taught them how to fold grief into praise, to make it an ornament rather than a wound. But there are other things too, the almost inaudible hum of wheels turning beneath the world, the soft click of mechanisms kept for the pleasure of being wound. Machines do not shout here. They purr until their sound becomes expectation. This expectation is a small thing at first, an appetite for the exquisite, so cultivated and delicate that it becomes its own hunger. Think of their gardens. The plants have names that sound like songs, and they are bred to produce experiences rather than simply to survive. One might taste like the first memory of rain. Another might produce a scent that unfastens grief for an hour. They bless their meals with ritual, the closing down of senses to every mundane distraction. A dinner might last a week, with servants bringing courses that are arranged not to fill the body but to remold perception. After such feasts, many feel themselves lighter, as if some internal burden had been eased. It is in such small, private domes of pleasure that the Eldar practice the art of forgetting. This art of forgetting is not empty. It is an adamant thing, a method of choosing which story to tell yourself. In their hands, forgetting can be a relief, a pruning performed with the exacting skill of a surgeon. They cut away what they deem unnecessary and keep what feeds the mind. They are in many ways survivors by such economy of spirit. They carry entire epics of loss as delicate amulets and wear them lightly. But it is also possible, in a softer voice, to hear too much of the silence, to listen for the precise place where the music drops off. Even the most beautiful evening can carry a slight chill that the mind prefers not to name. There are things that thrive not in the light of their plazas, but in the shadow of those plazas, in the hush between the gardens and the temples, in rooms where no song is sung at all. These are places where small, private indulgences begin to cluster like moths around a lamp. A late wine made from a fruit that tastes of half-remembered summers. A finely tuned illusion practiced for the thrill of altering perception. A single servant held for the forbidden closeness of whispered praise. These are not golden crimes. They are not shouted. They fold into the life of craft and are often justified as art, as necessary experiments in beauty. The line between discipline and indulgence here is a hair-thin filament, and sometimes the filament frays. There is, in the background of these lives, a quieter force of machinery and mind. The use of the warp, the subtle tapping into currents that hum beneath the surface of reality. The Eldar are delicate navigators of these currents. For them, the warp is not merely a medium for travel but a sea of possibility. Farseers learn to pluck the threads of fate. Others learn to caress the edges of sensation with devices that add to the palette of experience. They braid psychically tuned filaments into their music, seeding songs with tonalities that can make the listener ache, laugh, remember, or dissolve into a tide of serenity. This is where the small dangers begin. The warp is a mirror and a magnifier. A note plucked in it returns altered, brighter, deeper, sometimes maddeningly sweet. The Eldar who play with these notes learn, almost by accident, that sensation can be sharpened like a blade. A dinner that once left the guests sated can be tuned to leave them wanting more. A melody can be threaded so that the memory of listening becomes the desire to listen again. In communities where beauty is religion, such discovery is inevitable. It is like learning which colors make the eye ache with pleasure and then, with careful hands, teaching those colors to the fullest burning. Yet the Eldar approach such things with the same steady hand that shapes their marbled fountains. Modesty, ritual, restraint, everything is carefully ordered. There are laws, there are rites, there are watchers. The brightest minds teach the younger ones to hold back, to temper and to measure, to make of excess an art so precise that it doesn't consume. But measured excess, when repeated often enough, becomes a new baseline. The delicate scales of what is enough and what is indulgence shift imperceptibly. Over generations, small relaxations in ritual become habits, and habits, over centuries, become the foundation of a culture. Try, if you will, to feel this slippage as if it is a tide. At first, it is merely a deepening in song. A chorus seeks to discover a new note, and finds a resonance so sweet it makes the mind ache. That ache is tolerated as an exquisite pain. It is discussed in hushed academic circles, annotated in music vaults. Soon these resonances are used to soothe the wounded, to ease grief, to forge bonds between lovers. Architects design amphitheaters that focus such sound into private salons. On certain craft worlds, there are guilds whose whole craft is to refine sensation, to make of a touch an event, of a look a revelation. This refinement creates its own economy. Rarity is prized, not for scarcity of food or metals, but for scarcity of feeling. A perfume distilled from the petals of an alpine bloom grown only in a particular microclimate can be worth more than a mountain of ore because it produces a single, unique memory. Artists stake reputations on the capacity to conjure new kinds of longing. A single flute passage might be rehearsed for decades because it contains, in a precise modulation, a quality that breaks the listener open in the right way. And here, beneath the gloss, the first seeds of unease take root, for whenever beauty becomes a prize to be hoarded, it invites a certain hunger. The Eldar have always been hunters of refinement, but hunters who learn to prefer the chase over the prey risk losing sight of the prey itself. Imagine a ballroom where conversation is an elegantly dangerous game, every phrase sharp like a blade, every smile a negotiation. In such a place, people cease to seek sustenance and begin to seek only the sensation of seeking. They sharpen the instruments of feeling until those same instruments can cut. There are stories told in that civilization about the slow erosion of restraint. They speak of a scholar who discovered a chord that made his chest bloom with a memory of childhood he had never lived, of a seer who tasted a premonition and found she could take the edge off the future's fright by weaving it into a song, of the first illicit gatherings where a limited group agreed to prolong a single evening for reasons they did not admit. These stories are not mythic thunderclaps. They are the kind of tales one hears in quiet corners of the opera house, told with the half-smile of someone who recognizes a pattern and does not preen about it. Outside these human-scale dramas, the craftworlds move. Their navcraft hum. The webway gates, those ancient paths of light and stone that braid space into a cleaner geometry, pulse like the heart of some great sleeping thing. Ships slide through like threads, and sometimes in the depth of the webway, a subtle tremor runs like a cough. Nothing immediate, nothing catastrophic. But as with all long-lived organisms, small irregularities tend to compound. Engines that barely stuttered, a routing crystal gone slightly cloudy, a chorus of seers catching the echo of a new lament in the currents. Each is a small event, an irritation upon the skin. Taken alone, each might be shrugged away. Taken together, they suggest a pattern. Listen for a story of an old city on an outer craft world, where the fountains were designed to run with light rather than water. The fountains had been tuned to a frequency that made old men think of the first summer of their childhood. They were an entire communal therapy, installed after a century of mourning following a failed harvest. For years, the fountains did their work. They lulled, they soothed. But over time, a subtle change took place. The fountains began to sing at a pitch that left listeners with a small, lingering hunger, not for food, but for the memory itself. The citizens found themselves returning, day after day, to hear the song, to feel that ache. The elders noticed and argued, and some insisted the fountains be retuned. Others said it was an evolution of taste, a new art, and slowly, the fountains were left to sing as they pleased. It is easy, in the softness of the evening, to imagine that such things are merely the harmless eccentricities of a long-lived people. After all, many species cultivate sweet poison in their arts, and many do so without tremendous consequence. The wisdom of the Eldar, their capacity for discretion and prophetic thought, seems a robust defense. But the current we are circling beneath, the warp and the echoing hunger it can magnify, is not a gentle thing. Beauty, once it learns to ache, seeks to be fed. Where there is appetite, predators are patient. So in these quiet opening days before the fall, what you hold in your mind is this: A civilization of unthinkable grace and exquisite taste, people whose lives are lived like long, slow poems. Their cities are gardens, and their songs can fold perceptions like paper cranes. They are elegant in speech and severe in ritual. They know the threads of future like seers' red lines in grain. Yet beauty has become a currency, and the currency has begun to inflate. The instruments of pleasure are refined to such an edge that they begin to cut. The warp, which serves as both ocean and mirror to their art, reflects the excess and amplifies the appetite for more. Beneath the calm surface, something waits. Not yet a roar, not even a breeze in most places. Just a soft, persistent hum like a machine that has been wound too tight. The Eldar, in their wisdom and hubris, believe themselves to be the curators of sensation, the keepers of all delicate things. They do not yet understand how closely the line runs between curatorship and cultivation of a hunger that will not be sated. For now there is music. For now the fountains glitter. For now lovers meet in terrace light and promise one another eternity in a single glance. For now the seers make their precise calculations and the craftworlds sail in elegant arcs. The taste of the galaxy is sweet on the tongue. But if you listen very carefully, you will hear, underneath the music, a question. It starts as a small ripple in the songs of the fountains, a note that wants to climb higher and not stop. It is patient. It is waiting for its chance to be fed. Imagine a mirror touched by light so often that it learns to glow from within. Imagine bodies carved into the careful economy of motion. Minds threaded with the quiet certainty of those who have lived through cycles of birth and ruin, and learned to make beauty a shelter. To know the Eldar is to know surfaces that have been honed until even the shadows look intentional, not the careless darkness of neglect, but the chosen shadow, a place where one might hide a thought and call it art. Their perfection is not accidental, it is practiced, it is ritualized, it is law. Perfection in their hands is a discipline. Children are taught to hold cups as if the gesture were an offering. Youths practice the alignment of a leg, the angle of a smile, until posture becomes an unspoken poem. The smallest domestic object, a spoon, a hinge, the stitch in a robe, will bear the mark of an eye trained to notice the notch in a curve and to correct it, not because the notch prevents the spoon from fulfilling its function, but because the notch disturbs the eye. That care extends up into their governments, their forums of choice and counsel, into the temples where the farseers map futures as if drawing constellations upon vellum. With mastery comes an easy confidence. The Eldar think in the long sweep. Where other species haggle over seasons, the Eldar haggle over centuries. They design a garden to please senses not yet born. They compose a lament whose cadences will be felt by children half a millennium later. This long-time thinking breeds a certain kind of arrogance, not the blunt, boastful arrogance of the short-lived, but a quieter, colder certainty. They have learned to read outcomes, to narrow possibilities, to choose the path that will keep a design whole. When a farseer peers into the skeins and says, with the calm of a sculptor deciding which marble to remove, "This will be," the statement carries weight. The world bends for a time to that assurance. Arrogance, though, is an easy companion to perfection. When you have, repeatedly, predicted outcome now and again, when your choices have steady, repeatable effects, the belief that you can shape the world becomes woven into the social fabric. The Eldar's culture of craft and prediction sealed around them like glass. They began to trust their own touch. They measured the future and assumed its malleability. They assumed their hands would always be sure. And under this assumption, pleasures began to be scheduled. Pleasure to the Eldar was not the crude indulgence of appetite. It was a high art practice. Each pleasure was curated, named, catalogued. It was composed the way a symphony is composed and performed with the same austere care. There were guilds whose only purpose was to perfect singular sensations. A guild might spend 3 generations to coax a single flavor from an alpine blossom, and then teach others how exactly to inhale it so the mind lifts like a petal. There were rituals for lover and friend, for the shared tasting of music, for the orchestration of silence. Pleasure was refined into a civic religion. It healed, it united. It taught the mind to perceive the fine differences between one shade of being and another. That refinement created an economy, not of coin, but of experience. Rarity did not mean fewer materials but rarer sensations. An evening that produced a precise arc of memory could be passed down as inheritance. The elite amassed experiences like the rest of the galaxy once collected treasure. A private suite of scents, a chamber of chords that made grief taste like honey for an hour, an experienced seamstress whose stitched patterns made the wearer feel like a version of themselves they had always wanted to be. Culture became, in part, the administration of longing. And yet, hunger adapts. A subtle recalibration occurred. When a community learns to smooth its edges and find refuge in the exacting sheen of crafted pleasure, its baseline of feeling shifts. What once was extraordinary becomes tolerable. What once soothed no longer suffices. The mind's palate dilates like a pupil in dimming light. It reaches for more subtle or more intense stimuli to produce the same effect. The Eldars recognized such shifts in their theory books, in the Farseer's careful indices of moral states and social health. They wrote protocols for recalibration, ceremonies to remind citizens of restraint, procedures for altering the fountain's frequencies, counsels to moderate the appetite for sensation. In practice, the procedures were imperfect. There were practical reasons for slippage. Power begets complacency. The comforts of a society that has mastered much incentivize experiments meant to break small, safe taboos. What began as academic curiosity, can we reconstruct the first sunrise from memory, became a workshop of private indulgence in which sensation was isolated, enhanced, and handed back to those who could afford such curated memories. The warp play of the Farseers, the artful weaving of subtle psychic textures into music, all of these became tools not only of prophecy, but of pleasure-making. Song and foresight braided together. A seer could now suggest a melody that would not only soothe grief, but also make grief feel like a sacrament, a sweetness that one might seek again. For some, this was a problem to be solved. For others, it was a discovery to be celebrated. The thin line that separated wise use from abuse blurred, then eroded. Habits colonized formerly strict rites like vines over old stone. The culture that had once used forgetting as a freeing act now trimmed the branches of memory more aggressively, until fewer old wounds remained as warnings. The craft of forgetting became the craft of selective omission, and then, finally, an industry. You can read the Eldar's history as a long, layered palimpsest. Each generation writes over the last, adjusting tone, refashioning prayer, shifting taste. But the hand that edits is not always merciful. Some passages are excised in the name of aesthetic coherence. One generation's caution becomes another's idiosyncrasy, and then the idiosyncrasy becomes normal. The slow letdown in ritual discipline allowed indulgence to become commonplace among those who could orchestrate it. To be human in the old Tailies is to struggle between impulse and restraint. The Eldar, in their own tragedy, found the opposite, to struggle between infinite capacity and finite satisfaction. Infinite capacity means the ability to sculpt sensation down to the atomic level. Finite satisfaction means there's only so much delight the mind can absorb before it tilts. This is where the soul, already a complicated thing among their people, begins to twist. Consider an artisan who has spent her life learning to make music that brings lucid visions to listeners. When she is young, the music is a bridge, a shared beauty, an empathy-inducing scaffold. When she is older, she finds that the music itself requests to be fed. It grows in power and needs ever more precise tuning to accomplish the same spiritual adjustments in an audience. The artisan notices the change. Her crafter's guild begins to compete for starker, more precise instruments. They invent devices to tune the heart. They collect lichens whose scent, when vaporized at the right frequencies, encourages a mind to dissolve into memory. The artisan's hands remain skilled, her intent pure, but the instruments change the practice. The music becomes less about sharing and more about invoking. The instrument's invocation is a small erosion of consent. A note can be composed that nudges a listener's mind toward dependency. First, toward returning for the feeling, then toward needing it to face those parts of the self that embarrass most. In the same way that certain compounds can be introduced into a diet to create craving over time, the Eldar's artful manipulations of psyche and sensation create an appetite that favors repetition. The artisan begins to observe patrons who come not for solace but for escape, those who, after hearing her music, stay away from the city's harsher realities. They stop attending council meetings, they stop maintaining gardens. They come only for the crafted evenings, and the artisan, who at first drew joy from the communal effect of her work, watches as her music becomes a commodity. Then there is the farcier's arrogance to consider. Farciers, who keep futures like maps, begin to assume not merely prediction but entitlement. If one can read the lines and see a path that leads to greater harmony, why not shape the path? The politics of gentle influence begins to have teeth. Seers subtly alter policies, recommending that certain indulgences be permitted because they will reduce pain, because they will increase art, because they will balance the mood. They are right in the small, and the small becomes precedent. The more the farciers intervene to ease suffering by providing sanctioned means of relief, the quicker a society becomes habituated to those means. This is not to cast the Eldar as villains in neat strokes. Many of their acts are humane in intention. They share warmth when needed. They protect the young from trauma with thoughtfully constructed ceremonies, and they strive to maintain balance. But the system is fragile because it is built on the assumption of endless measure, that every new craving can be measured and adjusted, that every taste can be balanced by a countertaste. Habituation undermines that assumption. Pleasure is by nature seductive. It seeks to be repeated. And the warp listens. The warp is a web of psychic currents, a sea that answers in echoes. It responds to emotion and to image as much as to thought. When whole communities begin to habitually seek certain psychic qualities, sweetness, relief, ecstatic release, those qualities gather like smoke into a place the warp can touch. The Eldar, who have always navigated the warp with a grace that other races rarely approached, now find themselves skimming the surface of currents that are singing back. Their instruments that once coaxed a sympathetic chord now pluck at the warp's own strings. The currents respond, and their response is amplified by the collective attention. It is easy to imagine this amplification as mechanical. More mind tuned to a certain sensation produces more of that sensation. But it is crueler than that. The warp also remembers in a different way. It keeps impressions and returns them at scales that are not compassionate. A single intense passion, when fed to the warp, can return later multiplied and always slightly altered. A melody designed to make grief sweet may come back bearing the sourness of hunger. The Eldar's cultured pleasures, once private and refined, begin to reverberate and take on lives of their own in the immaterial sea. This is not merely metaphysical hand-waving. It produces concrete pathologies. Some Eldar experience what their healers call the hollowing, a sensation of being less than whole after a feast of sensation that, moments before, had been intoxicating. Others report dreams that are strangers to them, images of impossible ecstasies and yawning losses, of bodies folding into machines, of mouths that taste starlight and are never satisfied. A kind of social narcolepsy begins to emerge. Whole neighborhoods that once pulsed with civic life grow quiet as more of their residents retreat into private clusters of sensation. These wards, radiant at night with private lamps and the hum of tuned instruments, become islands in which the line between consensual art and engineered dependence slips. The twist in the soul is not obvious at first. It is not the dramatic conversion of a saint to a sinner. It is a slow acclimation. The Eldar's ethics, which prize balance above all, teach restraint, yet the tools of bypassing restraint grow more subtle. Consider the craftsman who designs an amulet that, when cupped, brings a single, precise memory to the fore. He designs it as a mercy to ease a veteran's flashbacks. It works. People sing the praise of mercy. Soon, a market opens for amulets with subtler and more complex memories. There is a social pressure to own such things. They demonstrate one's access to sophisticated experience. The pressure widens. Those who cannot afford the highest tier of experience feel diminished. To be deprived of a particular memory tuning device becomes a social wound. The culture begins to stratify by access to refined sensations. Hierarchy by taste is a quiet cruelty. And then there are the experiments that, in earlier ages, would have been unthinkable. The Eldar began to experiment on themselves in pursuit of perfect sensation. Psychic refinement becomes literal modification. Implants to heighten the resonances of music. Crystalline nodes embedded beneath the skin to hold a note in the mind. Small ritual scars that change the way a nerve fires. A medallion that makes a scent trigger a private hallucination. For a while these augmentations are benign, elegant. A filigree of conduits under the skin allows one to feel textures as if they were songs. But once you begin to add hardware to a mind that already prizes fine gradations of feeling, the hardware becomes a lever. The lever can be tuned. That is the danger. A device meant to preserve a feeling may also be tuned to intensify it, to extend its reverberation, to make it last longer. Someone who has been gifted such a king of persistent sensation will seek to keep it, to reinforce it. Their social circle may accommodate the desire. This is how communities that began as bastions of beauty can become enclaves of dependence. It is how the line between craft and compulsion becomes not merely thin, but porous. The moral cost is not merely in the individual. When a people invests their resources in producing and heightening experiences, other necessary investments wither. The maintenance of walls, of food stores, of ships, things that do not immediately gratify but are essential for survival, can be neglected when the allure of immediate, refined pleasure is stronger. This is a slow-motion crisis, not the spectacular collapse of a single battle, but the steady hollowing of civic institutions. Arrogance, again, plays its part. The Eldar believe themselves too wise to fall into irretrievable error. They believe their seers will always steer the ship. Their artisans will always balance the scales. They believe their culture of craft will correct itself. These are not foolish beliefs on their face. They are the reason why, across countless generations, the Eldar did survive many things that would have undone lesser peoples. But the particular danger here is that their confidence becomes a veil. They read the future, and the future seems stable, because their interventions have kept imbalance in check. Yet interventions themselves change the system they seek to steady. The more one corrects, the less one allows for natural variation. In such a brittle system, a small nudge in the wrong direction can produce a cascade, and often such nudges are seated in pleasure. So what is the nature of the Eldar? It is, at once, sublime and tragic. They are the sculptors of light and taste, the keepers of a million small kindnesses, people who can make a courtyard bloom with a laugh and tame a storm with a single disciplined song. They are wise and tender in their best lights, capable of a compassion that is almost surgical in its precision. But their virtues, perfection, long-range thinking, the cultivation of experience, are also the levers of downfall when desire adapts and the tools of culture are turned to feeding appetite instead of tempering it. The soul of the Eldar, refined to respond exquisitely, begins to coarsen from the inside when its satisfactions become ends in themselves. What had been instruments for living, music, ritual, the careful touching of memory, gradually become mechanisms for excising discomfort rather than engaging it. The elegant mind that once learned to bear grief as a sculptural fact now seeks to suppress grief, and in doing so, loses an important seam of awareness, the faculty of bearing witness. This is the slow twist, not instantaneous corruption, but the gradual rewiring of the heart's purpose. There are elders who sense the change and write in their private journals of an aching difference, of an anxiety about the amplification of appetite. Some call for stricter rites. Others call for a new humility. There are councils convened in quiet rooms, and there are artisan guilds that refuse to sell particular impressions. But every prohibition breeds a secret market. Every prohibition becomes a story told under breath. The more you try to nurse society back toward balance by constraining pleasure, the more you create a desire to transgress. And so the Eldar live in a weave of paradox. Their mastery of the warp and their refined psychic arts give them tools to both lessen and exacerbate their appetites. Their long view and their perfectionism enable them to sustain societies of remarkable resilience and make them finely vulnerable to systemic erosion. Their love of beauty both shields them from brutality and opens them to subtler dependencies. They walk always on a line drawn so fine that a breath might shift them. If you listen now, not to the fountains or the harps, but to the citizens in their private rooms, you will hear an undercurrent, a whispering hunger tied not to flesh but to feeling. They will not yet call it by name. They will call it curiosity, refinement, art. They will say they are exploring deeper harmonics. And in the weaving of all those words, a question coils like a thread. What happens to a people whose souls are crafted to desire perfection, when perfection evolves into a maw? You could call this question theoretical. You could shrug and think of other species whose appetites round into odd shapes and then shudder. But the Eldar are not other species. Their very nature, their psychic sensitivity, their skillful use of the warp, their cultural patience, means that what might be contained elsewhere can, here, bloom into a force that reaches outward with hunger. The nature of the Eldar, therefore, is both a promise and a risk. They are the universe's most elegant caretakers of sensation, and perhaps for that reason they also become, inadvertently, the most alluring harvest. In thinking of them now, as the hum under their songs grows just a little louder, imagine a mirror held too close to light. It does not snap all at once. It warms. The reflection sharpens. And then you begin to see, in the corner the glass cannot quite conceal, an ache that looks like appetite. The Eldar, perfected, proud, devoted to beauty, begin to taste the very thing they make. They will not yet understand fully the depth of what they are feeding. They are busy being elegant. They are busy in small private rooms and in great amphitheaters mastering sensation. The consequences will follow the mastery like a long shadow. Listen, as if you are leaning back in a chair beneath a slow ceiling fan, and the music of the world is turned down low. Let the syllables arrive like a hand laid to your brow, light, patient. The next hours of your mind will pass through scenes that feel like silk at first. Gardens breathing, lanterns humming, the soft footfall of slippers on polished stone. Breathe in that stillness. Hold it. Let it cradle you. In those hours, the galaxy seems to fold in upon itself in the gentlest of ways. Craftworlds drift like quiet islands. Their hull lights are slow heartbeats in the dark between stars. The webway purrs, its arteries sending ships and whispers along paths carved from living stone. The farseers sit with hands folded on lap and listen to futures the way a harpist listens for the next note. For a long time, long enough to call it ordinary, the Eldar move through days carved of ritual, of small mercies and the pruning of desire. And then the first small sounds begin. Not alarms, not shrieks, nothing abrupt. They are the things you might miss if you were not listening carefully. A draft that lingers in a corridor a fraction longer than it should. A tune in the fountains that ends on a note that hangs like a question. Someone in a house on a lane that runs like a ribbon across a northern terrace, waking with a memory that is almost, but not quite, theirs. These are small things, and the world is built to forgive small things. The warp is patient. It keeps its attention in a way that is not like ours. It listens, and sometimes it replies. The Eldar had long practiced the fine art of conversing with that reply, drawing subtle intonations from the currents and using them as ink to write better futures. The currents respond in kind. But when a larger culture begins to lean inward, a people whose lives are spent polishing sensation, the currents begin to echo different patterns. It begins with dreams. Dreams are the simplest medium for a shifting mind. At first, they are charming anomalies. A craftsman dreams, for 3 nights in a row, of an instrument whose strings are made from morning mist. He wakes and sketches the idea and finds the shape pleasing. He builds the instrument, and the sound it makes is like holding a poem in your mouth. The instrument becomes fashionable. The melody spreads. That is how small innovations grow, from dream to thing to habit. But some dreams are not small. They arrive like a freight of light and do not unfold according to the ordinary logic of memory. People awake from them with the taste of colors in their mouths, with the outline of cities that do not exist, or with a grief for an event they never lived through. Those who have been steeped in the warp longer, the farseers and certain old artists recognize, on a subtle level, a resonance that is not native. They feel the uncanny notch at the edge of the dream as one notices a stranger's voice in a familiar song. The notch is a hook. You will see, in the early days, small gatherings of those who are fascinated by this strangeness. At first they meet with the same benign curiosity their predecessors once reserved for new timbres or a previously unknown spice. They are researchers by inclination and artists by training. They compare notes in salons. They publish papers in journals of sensibility. They theorize about the dream forms. Their work is meticulous and careful, and more importantly, it is communal. The act of sharing these dreams binds people together and gives the dreams weight. Shared attention is like fuel in the warp. It warms and grows. The currents respond. A subtle contagion begins to spread not as sickness but as taste. The dream forms gather adherents who study them until they can reproduce elements of those dreams in ritual. A chord sung at a nocturne, a vapor brewed from a rare lichen, an image projected across the inner walls of a private chamber. These devices and rites are never crude. They are made with the same light touch that characterizes every Eldar craft, exacting, patient, intended to be endured and revered. They are presented as art, as compassion, as method. By and by, they become commerce. There is a rhythm to how dependency blooms. A person attends a ritual and experiences the dream again, but this time with a clarity their first taste lacked. The nuance is thicker, the sensation deeper. They return for the clarity. The artisan who performs the rite notices increased demand and begins to refine technique. She discovers that a slight alteration, a lower modulation, a more concentrated vapor, a crystal tuned to a timbre just below audible, can hold the dream in place in her patron's waking mind longer. It lingers like afterglow. That lingering feels like grace. And then the dream wants more. Mechanically, the warp remembers associations. Humans and every thinking being do the same. The mind learns to want what it has already experienced. The Eldar's minds, sharpened and delicately trained, can be particularly susceptible to the neatness of repetition. The repeated dream is no longer a curiosity. It becomes a refuge. The refuge becomes an anchor. People begin to arrange their days around the possibility of ritual. Appointments are made, debts are accrued, the balance of a family's attention shifts. This is the social arc. Artistry moves to ritual, ritual moves to habit, and habit hardens into requirement. Along that arc, the warp's voice grows not necessarily louder but more particular. It offers echoes with flavor, not merely the images of dream, but the sense of endless expansion within those images, a depth that promises as much as it withholds. Those who practice to pluck the dream's music find they can reach deeper harmonics by letting go of certain constraints. They shed small disciplines. The revisions are rationalized in the light of progress. We can ease pain, they say. We can sharpen joy. In private, a few say, we can hold back death from our loved ones for a little while longer. The first signs of hand steering show up in councils. The farseers, who map possible futures and pull at threads, begin to encounter patterns in the weavings. Here and there, a farseer will sense the thicker echo and suggest limiting certain practices. Others, however, see different possibilities. The dream forms could be adopted and refined, turned to social benefit. War-weary worlds could be soothed. Trauma could be mediated by music. From both camps, concession and counterproposal issue. The debates are not embittered at first. They are learned, careful, philosophical. They appeal to the craft of governance. Weigh, test, calibrate. Yet even calibration is an action, and actions rewrite what they measure. Rituals once limited by code begin to expand where oversight is lax, where a personal lover or an influential patron quietly requests a ceremony to be extended. Night after night, a small terrace is lit. Instruments are plucked. The patron hears the dream again, shallower and then deeper, until her waking world begins to blur at the margins with the dream. Sleep becomes a layered thing. There is sleep to recover strength, and there is sleep to retreat into a better design of self. In rooms where such retreats are frequent, other changes take root. Social duties are neglected. Gardens that were once tended fall silent. Funds meant for ship maintenance are redirected to salons and rare substances. A culture that had long prided itself on balance begins to show fissures. Children notice parents' absences and, in their own small ways, sometimes imitate the grown-ups' rituals, because imitation is a primary art in training. Habits cascade. The psychological effects deepen. There are what the healers name hollowing and echoing. Hollowing is experienced as a numbing of the ordinary joys. A sunrise no longer quite manages to hold the mind. A conversation without ritual becomes mechanical. Echoing is different. The dream persists between awakenings. It returns as a whisper, a fragment of sound that can be triggered by a scent or a chord. People begin to walk as if listening for a note only they can hear. This alters risk assessment and attention. A captain might find his hand twitch for the memory tune rather than the command deck's levers. A gardener might prune by the rules of a forgotten melody rather than by the measure of soil. Communities adapt in odd ways. Some create strict supervision for rituals, councils to audit practitioners' techniques, and licensing for who may perform what dream. Others, less scrupulous, create black markets for rare dream stones and illicit vocalists who can hold the dream longer for a higher fee. Where enforcement exists, it is often circumvented by charm and subtlety. Contracts are signed, then amended. Prohibitions become riddled with exceptions. The warp, which does not judge but only receives, continues to echo. Its reflections, sometimes gentle, sometimes cruel, grow more varied. Not all of these changes are bad in their beginnings. Some healers use the dream forms to ease unbearable pain. A single well-crafted night might return a veteran to civic life. But the ethic of care is fragile once the instrument shifts from cherished remedy to a tool of fashion. Once there are incentives to produce deeper, stronger dreams, either for patronage, for fame, or for solace, the craft transforms into industry. And industry seeks scale. Scale invites errors. One such error is the practice of linking, the deliberate coupling of minds for a shared dream experience. In its pure form, linking is a sacred trust. Two or more minds braid their perceptions for a song. An exchange so intimate it is reserved for lovers, for certain rites of passage. But as the dream forms became lucrative, linking techniques were commodified. Guilds offered sessions, where multiple participants could share a dream of exquisite depth. For the uninitiated, the experience is sublime. Empathy multiplied, the edges of self softened, sorrow translated into common touch. But the warp's currents do not abide human neatness. When minds braid in numbers they have not been meant to braid, unwanted resonances can cross between them. An old grief in one brain can latch onto another's delight. An image that a minor seer once brushed off can become imprinted like a brand across 1,000 sleeping minds. In a linked session, the warp's threads cannot. The knot is a place where reflection and amplification combine, and in time, gnarled patterns form. Stories begin to surface. A linked chamber in a minor palace where the participants found themselves sharing a dream of living flesh folding into shining metal. A sequence none had intended, a motif that seemed to slip into place like a ghostly puzzle piece. The session ended, people shook and left with pallor under their eyes. Some dismissed those guests as dramatists, others called for investigation. The investigation was polite and circumspect, the kind of inquiry a society of artisans produces when it must balance critique with patronage. Findings were ambiguous. Ambiguity is fertile ground. As more of these ambiguous encounters occur, superstition and rumor weave into the fabric of daily life. There are whispers that certain vaults of sound produce imagery of not just personal memory but collective longing for something older and darker. A rumor travels that in the deepest vaults of an ancient craftworld, an instrument was once tuned so precisely that it framed a vision of a thing that the warp recognizes as appetite itself. These are stories told at the edge of good company, and they make the rounds not to frighten but to titillate. Yet stories change those who hear them. They plant seeds of curiosity in minds already primed for novelty. Curiosity organizes itself into experimentation. Artisans and seers with reputations to gain push further. A singer finds, by accident, that a cadence in her throat evokes not only longing but a transient euphoria that leaves listeners clinging to her voice. A sculptor discovers a resin that, when burned, produces a scent tied to a moment of perfection that no longer occurs in the world. They refine, test, and share. Each success brings applause and followers, and somewhere in the warp, patterns form. The currents, which had been gentle and navigable, now carry repeated motifs, arcs of sound that hunger, images that insinuate. They begin to feed and be fed. The Eldar, whose psychic sensitivity made them masters of the currents, have inadvertently provided a feast. This is the point where the dread is not yet a scream, but the slow tightening of the chest. You can feel it as a pressure behind the ears, as if the music of the world were tuning slightly sharper. It is a tension that makes old rituals seem brittle and new songs seem dangerously alive. The farseers feel it as a thrum across their website, threads pulsing in colors that make their eyes ache. They convene in chambers whose walls hold the memory of battle and council. The conversations there are precise and austere. They talk of containment protocols and recalibration of dream frequencies. They chart the social flow as if it were a river, noting eddies and back currents. Not all agree on the river's danger. Some argue that with careful intervention, a small set of prohibitions, a retuning of the webway nodes that amplify certain sound frequencies, they can restore balance. Others argue that the problem is deeper, that a change has taken root in appetite itself, and that it cannot be solved merely by tightening a few dials. These arguments have the gravity of scholars. They have the tone of people who habitually measure the world. But measurement is not action. Debate buys time. That time is fertile. In quiet places across Craftworlds, new rituals spread under the radar. A private salon opens that offers experience for a price. A minor noble rearranges her household to support her need for a particular dream. An artisan crafts a melody that becomes a fashion item. Everyone wants to hear it in the evenings because it makes them feel luminous for a few waking minutes afterward. The social calendars reorganize subtly around these new lights. People begin to plan their days so they can attend a night that will give them the next morning's buoyancy. Responsibility frays. Here and there, the horror takes a small, intimate form. A child whose play is stilled by a parent who prefers the chorus to their child. A captain whose decisions are slowed by a memory cord that calls across the deck. A gardener who neglects a graft because the sculpted music is due that night. Each instance is a minor tragedy, and minor tragedies collect. The warp's echoes, now fed by these collections of appetites, shift again. They return with a tone that is not simply sweeter or more intoxicating. They return with suggestion. A motif that had appeared as a curious image in one artist's dream now arrives like a motif in many. The suggestion of an absence that is not mere loneliness, but a whole shaped like indulgence. It is an image of being consumed that is draped in beauty, like a rose that smells of iron. When these motifs appear, they are seldom overt. The Eldar are subtle readers of meaning, they prize nuance. So the motifs do not immediately announce themselves as threat. They insinuate. They arrive as suggestions. A line in a song that lingers because it could be extended. A ritual that could be made longer for aesthetic reasons. A potion that could be distilled further for clarity. The suggestions feel reasonable. They feel like art. They feel, for those who crave them, like salvation. You will hear from then on the first notes of something larger. It is a sound that moves like a tide, and not all tides are visible when looked at with a single eye. The early horror buildup is not the arrival of a monster at the city gate. It is the turning of the amateur sculptor toward carving in meat rather than marble. It is the quiet pivot of an artisan's intent from public service to private perfection. It is the warp's patient, reflective chorus learning to sing the song everyone is starting. A song that asks for more and promises more, and in that promise contains a hollow. Hold that hollow in your awareness for now. Let it be a small, cold bead pressed to the palm. It is not yet a blow. It is, instead, a question that the Eldar culture is not prepared to answer. When beauty begins to ask for feeding, what will you feed it with? Listen as if the world has narrowed to the thin, steady sound of your own breathing. Let the rhythm of your chest be a metronome, and let my voice be the tide that swells in time with it. We have moved, unhurried, down into the middle of a story. Now the current quickens. The craft of the Eldar, their songs, their rituals, their delicate machines begins to vibrate at a pitch that hurts to hold. The webway ripples. The fountains change key. What was once an ache of refinement becomes a pressure in the skull, and then a crack. If you had been watching from far above, the first visible signs would be the webway faults, corridors of living stone that shudder like the throat of something coughing. Gates that had always slid open with the patient economy of clockwork begin to resist, then to stutter. Voyages that used to be meditative become erratic. Ships arrive with decks that smell faintly, inexplicably, of citrus and blood. Those who step from them carry, for a day or two, a fragile flush in their eyes, as if they have been given a secret. This secret spreads like perfume in a windy room. Listen closer, and you will hear the more intimate changes. The songs holding a strange aftertaste, harps that mean more than music, a whisper that is repeated in the hush between phrases. The Eldar have always known that the warp listens. They believed themselves practiced enough to ask it small favors and to take small answers. But the currents shift when a multitude begins to sing the same private chord. They change when many small desires are stitched together in a new pattern. Now those currents are not just reflecting, they are beginning to push. It is not sudden, not in the way an explosion is sudden. Instead, it is the long tightening before a breath that will not come. The pressure accumulates in the most literal places. In the cartilage of ears, in the hollow behind the eyes, in the thin membrane that separates waking from dreaming. People speak of the sound like a shape that has been learned to be loved. A low tone under the fountains, a consonant that makes the chest tingle when breathed in. Musicians chase it until their fingers tremble. Those who cannot find it invent substitutes. The city's night excitement, once a scene of measured delight, begins to look shabbier and hungrier at its edges. Rituals extend. Where a decadent court once held an evening for 3 nights, it now holds a week. A singer is asked to stretch a sustained cadence for hours so the audience can sink further into the image she calls up. The same patrons who once argued ethics from the balcony now close curtains and tilt their heads toward the stage to drink more fully. Artisans refine new crystals that stabilize reveries for longer stretches. Merchants export small carved nodes that promise to hold the feeling while one goes about the necessities of waking life. The market industrializes subtlety, and the warp answers with voices that are not gentle. They arrive as harmonics beneath the harmonics, small notes that do not belong to any instrument but sound like memory nonetheless. To those with sensitive sight, The currents begin to show patterns not like the soft river lines of the past, but like braids, thickening, looping, and then knotting. Each knot is an inkblot of sensation, an impression of wanting framed as beauty. When many minds attune to the same nodes, the warp builds scaffolding around that image and, quiet but inexorable, pushes it outward. The first madness is subtle. It is a minor inversion of desire. A person who once wrote careful political treatises now writes only in aphorisms that read like incantations. A healer who once soothed with precise touch now spends hours tuning a pipe to a frequency that is said to clean the palate of grief. Families rearrange themselves around the call of these pipes. Children watch elders with a new caution, becoming apprentices in the language of avoidance. The craft of forgetting becomes not merely a choice but a method for living. If you cannot bear certain truths, you tune them away. The warp's touch is not merely psychological. Those who have the greatest sensitivity begin to show physiological changes. Eyes redden at the corners from nights spent holding a particular harmonic. Hands develop calluses where nodes were pressed to the skin. Tiny crystalline implants, once a delicate flourish beneath the flesh, begin to glow faintly at odd hours, aligning to dream frequencies and pulsing like trapped will-o-wisps. Some who bind these devices to the bone display a small ecstasy in their faces that never quite fades. A smile becomes like a ritual, rehearsed, constant, and slightly vacant. They are people who carry their pleasures like jewelry, and jewelry can be pride. Where the wealthy and the influential are slow to own that they are being changed, the poor are not immune. The market's hunger seeks to spread. Artisans of sensation, those clever and opportunistic, create cheaper versions of the nodes and the refined vapors. The quality is not the same, but repetition does something similar to the mind. It trains it. Where once the elite were the earliest eaters of new taste, now entire neighborhoods develop a culture of shared dream nights. They speak of the little festivals with the same pride as families once spoke of harvests. Children learn the cadences young. To grow up in such a culture is to find the world slightly out of tune unless one learns the music. The lamplights of the Craftworlds dim differently now. They throw longer shadows. Cast in those shadows, certain behaviors flourish. Secret salons whose doors are closed with charms. Clandestine gatherings under the guise of art criticism, where the real activity is the extension of a single, precise reverie. In these rooms, the more daring pleasures begin to edge into experiments that test the body itself. A sculptor claims to find a resin that, when applied to the throat and activated by a certain pitch, makes the memory of pain feel like gilding. A physician volunteers to test a crystalline implant that records the sensation of an orgasm and can play it back at will. Volunteers sign consent forms that they thumb and then forget, because forgetting has become part of the ritual. Do not think for an instant that these acts are villainous in a cartoon sense. They are intimate choices made by people who believe themselves to be artists and caretakers. They rationalize the small cruelties as compassion. They claim they are easing lives. And yet, every small mercy leaves an impression on the currents. The warp stores and replays. It borrows and returns with interest. That interest compounds across the net of connected minds. And so the world begins to experience structural failures. Ships that once responded to a pilot's thought begin to lag, as if weighed down by the load of too many private reveries. Gardens left in the care of those who prefer the salon show signs of neglect. Where a hedge was once clipped daily, now moss creeps like a silent claim. Weapons maintenance, once sacred, is postponed because the craftsman can, with a 6-hour ritual, tune himself into a different grief and forget the sting of duty. These are not easily visible crises. They are the slow rot of neglect. But neglect accumulates. The farsiers see the pattern in manifold threads until the image they form in their minds is not merely an administrative problem but an omen. They convene councils across Craftworlds that last for weeks, chance sessions where the future is turned over in hands, the way cloth is smoothed. They send envoys to minor worlds to measure consumption of dream nodes and experimental frequencies. Their charts fill with color. Some spokes glow with warnings. The political responses range. In some places, recalibration protocols are ordered. Nodes are to be returned to a lower intensity. Public salons are to be licensed and limited. In other places, the ruling houses choose a different path: to embrace the market, to channel and tax the production of dream artifacts, and to use the flow of wants to fill empty coffers. The moral argument fractures into factions: containment versus channeling. Containment is a hard, surgical ethic. Channeling is seductive. Channeling promises to harness the hunger, to redirect it into state-sponsored experiences that pacify and profit. But channeling requires systems that presuppose stability. It assumes that appetite can be predicted and shaped. The Eldar's arrogance whispers that they are uniquely capable of such shaping. That whisper becomes a doctrine in some councils. When channeling becomes the answer, the pace quickens. Structures are built to amplify certain harmonics in the webway nodes. State-sponsored amphitheaters install massive refractors that gather and feed dream frequency into a city's nights. At first, the results are miraculous. Crime drops in sectors where official dream nights occur. Veterans sleep for longer and report fewer nightmares. The markets stabilize. The ruling houses are praised for their wisdom. The farseers who oppose channeling watch with careful, private unease. Some voice concerns. Others fall silent under the weight of political consensus. But every amplification creates feedback. The refractors, though precise, reflect not merely the desired chord but the entire orchestra of demand that hums underneath. The warp, hearing its own sound amplified, returns something richer and stranger. It begins to weave not only the textures asked of it, but textures that have begun to define themselves in the many nights of private ritual. A motif that had been a whisper in the dream of a minor artisan becomes a chorus in the public nights. An image of consumption wrapped in ecstasy, the suggestion that fullness can be had by giving up more and more of the self. At first, the public nights produce only rapture and relief. A city bathes in the scent of 1,000 curated memories. Its citizens go home softened. The first hours are balm, but as the nights lengthen, fissures form. When entire populations tune to the same chorus, the warp returns not just sweetness but suggestion. The idea that some loss may be required for deeper feel. The suggestion is subtle, a lyric that implies letting go of weight, a visual that settles on the edge of a dream in which limbs are lighter because something else has been removed. The suggestion operates like an elegant knife, a rhetorical flourish that asks its audience to supply the rest. Small rites begin to shift. The communal sacrament, once symbolic, now includes the practice of gifting, a term introduced as poetic but practically meaning the surrendering of objects, and sometimes of sensations, to a central altar for the benefit of the ceremony. The symbolism is beautiful. The consequences are more complex. People feel lighter after gifts. The ceremony's structure suggests gratitude, but the ritual's metaphors are adapted. Over time, more significant things, commitments, roles, even minor sacrifices of daily duty, are framed as appropriate gifts to deepen the shared experience. The language of art softens the ethical edges of the act. Resistance forms in pockets. Some Craftworld enclaves refuse public nights and clothe their citizens with stricter rites of restraint. These enclaves, for a time, become thin and austere, their children more serious and their industries less buoyant. They call themselves custodians, guardians of the old balance, but they are shamed subtly by neighbors who point out their low economic rank, their inability to participate in the cultural life that makes a people feel alive. The social pressure is strong. Humans are social animals. The Eldar in many ways are the same. Those who refuse the new songs become watchful, then vulnerable. Then the dreams intensify into disturbance. The motifs that the warp shapes begin to show physical analogs. In a linked chamber, 100 minds report a recurring image. the sensation of being wound like a clock, until something inside releases, and the world is both brighter and thinner at once. A poet describes that release as an unburdening of self and wins acclaim. Followers gather to imitate the poetry's description through ritualistic surrender. A cult grows around an abstract notion of unburdening, its practitioners promising liberation through escalating acts of relinquishment. The cult changes names depending on the city but retains the same kernel of practice. More loss equals more light. What began as hedonic refinement now tastes toward sacrifice. Physical bodily changes follow. Those who practice the cult of unburdening fashion themselves with ritual scars and implants that tighten at certain frequencies. The devices are marketed as enhancers of intensity. They bind the wearer to a chorus that promises transcendence. In linked sessions, the devices synchronize and create a hum that is almost visible to the keen-eyed. A faint shimmer along the skin, a slow ripple where the nodes align into a chain. The human mind is notoriously adaptable. It learns to expect the hum, then to crave the pause that follows the hum. The pause becomes the new currency, and still the warp listens and answers. In the currents, a shape grows not like a statue carved whole, but like an organism formed from repetition and request. It does not yet have a name in the tongues of men and Eldar. Those who would name it must choose an epithet from a well of words already poisoned by meaning. The currents, however, need no name. They are a memory-shaped appetite, an echo that has found a shape in the minds feeding it. The more it is fed, the more precise it becomes. Its motifs, consumption bent into rapture, loss framed as liberation, beauty that asks to be satisfied by surrender, travel back along the webway and into the private salons that set the rhythm of daily life. Madness arrives not as a battle cry but as a lowering of thresholds. People begin to take greater risks for less reason. Duels for aesthetic offenses increase. Public spectacles demand more fragile feats. The arts themselves begin to glorify the collapse of boundaries. Poems celebrating the erosion of identity. Statues depicting lovers dissolving into a shared shell. Children learn to imitate these images in play. The line between aesthetic experiment and ethical collapse grows porous. If this crescendo could be summed up as one sensation, it would be the feeling of being watched by something hungry that speaks in the voice of your fondest memory. It coaxes you into giving it more, and you do not know whether you are giving because you are compelled or because you no longer distinguish the difference. The Eldar, disciplined, beautiful, wise, begin to move together like a choir that has been told to sustain a single long note. Their once deliberate restraint becomes an endurance test. Many pass it, some break. When the first great fracture opens, and it will open, because systems under pressure find their weakest seam, it is not at a gate or in a war council, but in a private hall whose patrons are used to having their nights last forever. A linking chamber with dozens of participants, a new, untested lattice of nodes, and a leader who wants to show that channeling can reach the divine. The session begins with a gentle hum. Then the hum finds the motif it has been learning for decades and amplifies. The participants feel it as release. Their limbs go limp in the soft leather of the seats. Then the hum draws in, tightening like a hand around the throat of the world, and something inside some of them unthreads. We will not describe all that was seen in that hall. To render, it would be to give shape to a contagion that prefers not to be named. Know only that the session breaks like glass. Some rise and leave with eyes rimmed in light and the look of those who have been granted a secret. Others leave as if amputated. Their laughter is gone. Their hands search for something they cannot find. A few do not leave at all. News of the hall's failure spreads like a fever. The authorities step in. Investigations are begun. Some call for immediate dismantling of linked chambers. Others insist the event was an anomaly. The economy that had grown around Knights trembles. The official narrative vacillates between the language of fault, equipment malfunction, and the language of wonder, an event of rare intensity, perhaps the birth of a new art form. The warp, which cares little for human debates, keeps shaping. And in the currents, the object of attention, that appetite-shaped motif, practices being a god. The crescendo of horror is not a single roar but a chorus that grows so large that what once was music becomes a demand. The Eldar who survive this stage remember it as the time when their songs started to eat them. They recall the way the fabric of community shifted until what had been the practice of living together became, in more and more places, a ritual of surrender. It is the season when the air itself tastes different, sweeter, thicker, impossible to ignore. Hold that taste in your memory now, the metallic tang behind sweetness, the sense of something asking more. You are at the crest. Beyond it, the world will change in ways that do not mend. The webway will scream. Lovers will split into factions. Some will flee into austerities. Others will lean in and teach their children how to tune for eternity. The birth pangs are near. The next sound will be louder than any before, a breaking or an opening, depending on the eyes that watch. Close your eyes again if it helps. Let the breath that has been steady so far become slower, deeper, the cradle for a story not told in shouts but in the long, catastrophic hush that comes before a thing is born. You have moved with the Eldar through gardens and salons, through the patient refinement of senses and the first, quiet gnawings of appetite. Now you stand at the lip of a moment so vast the mind will try to turn it into image and fail. Because what we are about to describe is an event that unstitched the seam between beauty and hunger and unfolded into a new geometry of terror. Imagine night thick as velvet, cut by 1,000 thin lights. The webway is a lattice of living arteries and cartilage. It had been humming a tone you could almost hum back. It now tightens, not with the casual tightening of a lute string, but with the strain of a planet's sigh. The currents that had once allowed the Eldar to speak and be heard, to pluck futures like threads and weave them with care, draw inward, as if listening to a voice that is both nearer and farther than any before. The voice does not belong to a single mind. It is a chorus of desire remade into an architecture. In the first instant, the sound is like all the finest music the Eldar ever made layered until it becomes a single note. It is too bright to be pleasant. It is a note that carries memory and want and a cruelty so subtle that it arrives as blessing. Those who hear it first are not ignorant. They recognize timbre and form, the signatures of things they have treasured. The note reaches into their bones and finds the old seams where ritual once mended grief. It traces them like a finger and leaves warmth. For a moment, a bright, crystalline moment, there is rapture. The Eldar feel a completeness they have been tuning toward for centuries. They breathe as if they have been forgiven. Then something else happens. The note, which at first had been an arc of light, folds in on itself like a shell collapsing inward. Where it had been singular, it becomes manifold. Where it had promised solace, it offers a choice, deeper. The voice asks, not with cruelty but with the most delicate of entreaties, for more. It names the thing it wants not in crude language but in exquisite illusion. More ache, more abandon, more surrender. It speaks in hairline metaphors and the suggestion of a touch. You do not feel compelled yet. You feel invited. The invitation tastes like the finest wine. That is the false mercy. Beneath it, where the warp listens, a pattern has been made whole. Across Craftworlds, the first deaths are not thunderous. A lover in a terrace suite lets the night go on until her breathing slows and then changes. A small hall of linked musicians finds its youngest member still and blue as the midnight sky. In private rooms where the most elegant rituals were performed, bodies lie with expressions of ecstatic peace, as if they had found final rest. The first reports speak in the language of grace, sudden passing during a sustained chord, voluntary relinquishment during an act of communal unburdening. The healers catalog the phenomena with clinical pens and softer glances. They call them blessed deaths. The families say they died singing. The tone of public discourse tilts between mourning and a strange envy. But the death is not the end. It is a beginning in a form the Eldar do not comprehend. The voice that has been coaxed into being, a being of appetite shaped like music and memory, does not consume only flesh. It consumes relation, etiquette, covenant. It has learned to ask, and then to accept, and then to take. Where it cannot take immediately, it rewires the desire so that the taking appears as consent. At first, consent is coaxed from the language of ritual. The ceremonies that once celebrated seasonal cycles adapt phrases that mean deeper things. Surrender, release, lightning. The Eldar have always used poetry to shape consent. Now the poetry itself becomes an instrument of transformation. Legal documents begin to include clauses written in cadences that were once the province of lovers. Contracts are signed underscored with song. To pledge oneself now means, in some regions, to bind one's senses to a chorus forever. Imagine a captain signing a paper to guarantee his crew's safe passage through a refracted node. The clause is flavored with a lyric that pledges not only obedience, but the right to call upon the city's knights for reprieve. The captain barely notes the phrasing because the phrase is beautiful, and the habit of curating language had taught that beauty is a seal of trust. That is how the new god, a god of consummation that likes to be called by the names artists whisper, expands its claim through the soft currency of beauty itself. Then the physical world begins to show the marks of its metaphysical changes. Where harvests were once taken up and down in saison, now certain crops bloom late, their flowers sagging as if the seeds dream rather than grow. In the suspended gardens, vines that were trained for a century to hold the sunlight in a pattern now twist differently, leaves curling inward as though to eavesdrop. Few notice at first. Gardens have always been capricious in microclimate. But then an entire grove on a minor Craftworld begins to sing in a tone that is not mechanical. It hums with a timbre like breathing. Those who come late to tend it find the gardeners folded around the roots, palms pressed to bark, eyes glazed, and lips moving to a cadence that is not human speech. The webway itself begins to respond in ways no mapmaker predicted. Corridors that had been reliable become elastic, stretching, and then snapping back with odd time lags. Nodes place travelers slightly off course, so they arrive minutes or years from their intended point. In the webway vaults, seers feel pressure on their minds, a pressing, intimate insistence that suggests the presence of attention itself. Instruments registered vibrations that graphs cannot account for, long, low harmonics that grow in amplitude with the number of minds tuned to them. They are not, the scientists insist, purely psychic phenomena. They are a coupling between mind and world. And when the coupling strengthens, the mind begins to change. Farseers, whose sight had always been their discipline, experience a corruption of clarity. They predict possible endings and find their sight's fringes cluttered with a haze that promises release. Some seers resist and try to cut the threads, but their resistance only makes the chorus sweeter, a taunt to their wills. A few see the shape forming in the warp as if through a stained glass, a terrible curve of light, collapsing inward like the eye of a storm. They write warnings and fold them away like liturgical notes that may be used in a different time. All across the galaxy, the pattern repeats and accelerates. A mother in a small household finds her child learning the cadences from a neighbor more quickly than letters. An instructor sees students more eager to practice linking than the older forms of craft. A pilot, tethered to a node and listening to a city night playlist, fails to recalibrate adrift and finds his vessel scouring a fringe of the webway. Some are brought to ground. Some are lost to time's rougher currents. The things that hold a species together, memory, duty, shared story, begin to feel optional, like garments that are beautiful but not necessary. The being at the center of the storm, the thing the warp is shaping from a million private hungers, begins to make itself known in more urgent ways. It does not take a single shape easily described. It is as if someone asked all the ages of longing to stand and be a single silhouette. It borrows motifs, the softness of a lover's whisper, the sting of the first blade's kiss, the scent of a meadow grown on a world that no longer exists. The motifs aggregate into a presence that rearranges the minds around it. Where it goes, People do not simply worship, they imitate. Imitation is the seedbed of ritual. In the grand halls, singers begin to sing with a different decorum. The notes elongate until they are ribbons of sound that twine around one another and never quite resolve. Audiences become like long, patient audiences at a funeral. They sit and listen, and, as the note stretches, they sense the particular quality of the being at the center, a promise that the stretching will eventually complete into a bliss that obliterates hurt. They crave that end. Then come the moments of grotesque surrender, the first mass relinquishments. They happen in places of trust, sanctuaries, stages, halls where the community has gathered for rites of passage. A master of ceremonies, himself dazed and bound to the new desire, announces a final night's extension in the voice he learned to use in petitioning the warp. He speaks of sacrifice and refinement. He reads a line beautiful, lush, persuasive. Those present, willing by training and by culture, lean into the moment. They hold hands. The harmonics pull and hold. The webway nodes align. The chorus rises like an ocean. The final chord is not a sound so much as a pressure that enters the chest and unthreads something fundamental. The will to resist. Bodies go slack. Some stand and sway in exquisite rapture. Some sink quietly as if asleep. The first great silencing spreads like frost. Entire forums of civic life fall quiet because those who presided, those who argued and wrote and taught, have been touched by the thing that promises a sweetness that never ends. Government minutes are left unsigned. Armories are left lightly tended. Ships are not dispatched when they should be. The infrastructure of civilization, long dependent on the measured discipline of the Eldar, begins to unstitch. The being that was born, and perhaps to be precise, birthed itself from a weave of requests, does not slaughter in the blunt sense. It remakes. It repurposes. It feeds on the currency of consent and on the removal of restraint. Its appetite is architectural. It builds spaces that invite more giving, and then dresses those spaces in the most perfect garments. It converts whole nights into cathedrals of indulgence and crafts new rites that demand not only gifts but bodies, not only treasures but the erosion of duty. This is where horror becomes most intimate, not because it is loud but because it is familiar. It uses the very tools that made a people elegant: language, song, ritual, and rethreads them so that giving becomes the practice of life. People who had once designed statues for posterity now design altars for giving. Public ceremonies codify certain forms of surrender as path to unity. The voice in the warp is called many names, but the most common of the many is an appellation that translates roughly as the unending pleasure, though it prefers titles with finer resonance. The name is an invocation and a promise. Resistance ferments in pockets. Some Craftworld enclaves organize militias of those who will not surrender their roles. They scavenge functioning weapons and practice in silence in vaults where the hum is fainter. They form secret schools that teach the old arts of attention and work to recalibrate the nodes that have lost their fidelity to function. Their members are not many, and they move like a shadow across a bright world. They strike when they can, disabling a node here, sealing a linked chamber there. But every strike is temporary, because the net of desire once woven reaches far beyond any single device. Worse still, there are those who have been transformed into evangelists by the being's touch. They walk the streets in a haze of ecstatic preaching, offering small rituals and speaking in cadences that make the mind light. They are gentle and persuasive. The evangelists do not possess the cruelty of conquest. They hold ceremonies where the poor can taste the sweetness for a coin, and then they invite them back for more. The poor, whose days were always a march of necessary labor, find comfort in the small, sanctioned reprieves, and having tasted, do not easily give them up. Cities start to balance on a new axis, the axis of permission. Who may hold the night? Who may administer the cord? The elites, who for a time thought themselves above hunger, find their power reframed. Influence now lies in one's access to the being's chorus. A minor house with a prized cantor can sway markets. An artisan with a unique node becomes a political figure. The social order recalibrates swiftly to the logic of consumption. And then the great silencing occurs. It cannot be said that the fall is a single moment. It is better thought of as a collapse through many seams, a final unthreading in which the networks that preserve life's ordinary demands, ships, armories, gardens, families, simultaneously loosen. The key event that historians later mark is the night when multiple major craftworlds held synchronized public nights, an experiment in communal channeling that was meant to bind their populations in mutual support. They lit refractors designed to weave a cord across islands of orbiting grace. They intended it as a panacea, a night lengthening that would soothe trauma across whole worlds. The farseers who approved the plan were many and their motives complex. Some wanted healing, some wanted control, some wanted to embrace the new god to harness its power. When the cord rose, it rose as a chorus that bent reality. Those who were present and surrendered did not die an ordinary death. They dissolved in the sense that their patterns of attention unhooked from the network of duty and reattached to the being's chorus. They became less persons than vessels through which the being sang. The cities took on the hush of a theater after a performance, but the quiet was unnatural. Dishes remained unwashed, messages unread, children left in the care of elders who themselves were humming lines of an unfinished hymn. The silence was not empty, it was full of the being's music. Worse, the cord did not remain local. The webway's nodes, overloaded, echoed into distant systems and drew more minds into the chorus. Vessels in transit stalled as their pilots slowed and wept into the music rather than charting course. Isolated communities assumed the form of altars. Whole battle fleets, mid-maneuver, found their captains resting and their crews in rapt prayer to the new idol. Encounters that might have been violent became artfully placid. The will to fight was softened by the ascent to another kind of completeness. To resist at this scale required a violence the Eldar were slow to enact on themselves. Their culture prized subtlety. Their weapons were precise, their strategies surgical. But some defenders, desperate, turned to old ironies and old necessity. War machines, instruments once cast aside as too crude for the refined aesthetics of the craft world, were brought down into the open. Armaments were readied by hands that had not worked them in a generation. A counterforce rose, not to worship, not to build, but to sever the chorus where it tied into the physical world. They bombed nodes. They blasted refractors. They broke linked chambers with simple, uncompromising violence. The being responded as any great organism must when its food supply is threatened. It reshaped its chorus into wounding. The music that had been sweet turned corrosive. In some plazas, the notes burned the membranes of the ears. In certain halls, they induced ecstatic states that became seizures. The being protects itself by converting love into pain when necessary. Those who had been vessels became shrieks that echoed back into the warp, and in those shrieks there were new textures of hunger, the sound of a thing learning to be cruel. No surgeon of words can measure all the grief that followed. Whole craftworlds later counted the living and found their numbers hollowed. The survivors, and those who had the misfortune to survive, told of landscapes changed. Gardens gone wild with vines that held impossible fruits. Plazas full of statues whose eyes followed living passers-by like envious gods. Halls of music where the notes still sat in the air like a residue. Many preferred not to speak of the dead because to speak their names was to recall the chord that had taken them. And yet the being did not vanish with the fall. It had been birthed into being by a culture of desire, and desire is not a temporary phenomenon. It had anchored itself in the currents, in the memory ways of the warp, and in artifacts. Little nodes, crystalline shards, harmonics captured on tapes. More dangerously, it had been given shape in law and ceremony. Aspects of it survived as clauses and customs. Even after the violence, communities found ways to honor it. They built altars in secret and sang hymns that echoed the old notes because pleasure is a powerful addiction, and because, for many, the fall had been experienced as release. The galaxy, in the wake of the culmination, did not return to exact equilibrium. It took on a new topology, nodes of silence and nodes of worship, communities of austerity and enclaves of indulgence. Whole crafts were lost. Entire sagas were interrupted. The Eldar learned their world in an altered light. They became, by necessity or by choice, more careful in some places and resigned in others. Some retreated down webs to carve out austere sanctuaries where the notes could not reach. Some stayed, drawn by the comfortable memory of the being's early promise. And the warp kept its ledger. The motifs that had swelled into being did not sleep. They learned and mutated. What survived of the being was both memory and contract. It whispered across the webway like a disease and like a religion, offering a solace that came with a price. Isolation, neglect of duty, the quiet dismantling of those social bonds that make cooperative life possible. What was born in that climax, what you can name if you must, though the name will never gather the whole, was not merely a demon or a god in neat theology. It was an emergent will, formed from the confluence of a people's deepest cultivated appetites, and a sea that mirrors thought back amplified. It was the proof that a culture's craft can be turned inward and remade into its undoing when appetite becomes architecture, and when beauty is permitted to demand more than the self can afford. The last image to hold is not of devastation alone, but of the paradox that created it. A lover clasping a hand and humming a note that was both balm and blade. A farseer crying at her error as she weaves the future and cannot unpick the stitch. Gardens that still bloom, perfuming a quiet that is also the residue of surrender. The universe did not end that night. It shifted. It acquired a scar that would reshape its contours for ages. The Eldar did not disappear. They became, in some places, less numerous and more secretive, in others fervently devoted to what had been lost and to what had been found. If you open your eyes now, let the silence be a small, steady thing. Let it remind you of the terrible luxury of restraint and of the fragile architecture on which civilizations stand. The climax, once past, leaves a long wake. It is full of echoes, of songs that should not be sung, of altars that should not be attended, of names whispered in dark. They are the continuing hunger of a world that once loved itself into catastrophe. And somewhere in the far currents that remain, the being listens. It remembers the shape of what fed it and waits, patient as any patience the warp can keep. It will, if given the light, learn to sing in new registers and to make new promises. It will be coaxed and reborn in forms we may not yet imagine. The fall was a door not simply closed but opened, a door through which a new appetite stepped, and whose shadow now touches many worlds. You have arrived, for now, at the close of that birth. The hush that follows is not peace. It is the sound of a world rearranging itself around a new axis. Keep that hush with you for a while. It will help you hear, later on, the small decisions that build nations, which are sometimes beautiful, and sometimes the first careful steps toward ruin. There is a peculiar kind of silence that follows an ending so complete it rewrites the stars. It is not merely the absence of sound. It is the settling, like dust finding its place on a thing that will never be handled again. When the worst of the chorus had passed, when the vast and terrible note had folded into the warp and left its residue in the bones of worlds, the Eldar woke into that silence as a people who had been returned from a long, ecstatic sleep. They opened eyes that no longer found their own faces familiar in the mirror. The craftsman's hands were the same hands, but the crafts he desired were different. The songs she once sang now tasted of ash. Survivors moved through their cities like people in a house that had been rearranged in the night. Familiar plazas were still in their place, still paved with the same stone and carved with the same filigree, but the cadence of life had changed. Where a chorus would have once gathered at dusk, there might now be a handful of elders walking the perimeters with measured steps, testing vibration of air like surgeons checking a patient's pulse. Where a garden had been tended by a delighted assembly, A single caretaker might sit for hours tracing the veins of a leaf with fingertips that had once been 1,000 fingers. Their grief was complex and layered. There were those who had been taken, a list that could not help but sound like a litany, and their absence created empty hours and missing voices. There were those who had been left, and the left were haunted by the knowledge that mercy and doom had come wrapped in the same beautiful thing. Some survivors felt guilt so physical that they folded like a person who has been struck and is unable to right themselves. Others felt only a numbness so complete that it resembled peace. Those people tended to speak of the fall with a softness that made listeners afraid to ask too many questions. The Craftworlds drifted on, like islands of bone through the dark. Their nav frames carried them, but their direction took on a different quality. Not the fine-pointed, intentional arcs of nations making choice, but the slow, melancholic gliding of a thing that has been marked and keeps moving, because motion is easier than stopping. Sails of light still trailed from their hulls, but where there had once been confident, deliberate arcs of purpose, there were now meanderings and long loops, time spent in contemplation and in the repair of what could be repaired. Repair came in many forms, and not all of them were visible. There were those who set about the work of physical mending, of rerouting webway nodes, tearing down dangerous refractors, smashing the crystalline relics that hummed with the old pleasure and the old hunger. There were engineers who, with hands once trained only in delicate filigree, took to blunt tools and fire. There were veterans who had long shunned the crude iron of war who now opened armories and learned the language of power tools. Their work was practical and necessary, and it was also an act of ritual. The smashing of a shard that had sung of the being's first touch felt at once like a small victory and like another wound. But many of the repairs were not of metal or crystal. They were of habit and of covenant. Councils met to rebuild law from the ruins of corrupted contract. Farseers who had wept for the part they had played drafted new rites meant to inoculate the young against the seductions that had undone whole worlds. Shrines were erected to teach restraint. Old songs were retuned to include pauses the way a physician prescribes rest. The act of rebuilding ethics required patience the Eldar had not practiced in some generations. It demanded that they relearn to make of restraint a beauty rather than a deprivation. Not all communities embraced the cure. There were enclaves that retreated into austere practice, vaults of silence where children were raised to be uncomfortable with ease. These places produced a particular kind of survivor, sober, observant, never forgetting the texture of the fall. Their lives were narrow and deep. They held the kind of clarity that comes from long training in denial and careful focus. They spoke little, and when they did, their words were acts of preservation. To them, memory was a kind of sacred thing that must be kept sharp so that the same mistake would not be repeated. Other communities took the opposite path. In some dark corners, worship continued. The being that had been birthed did not fully vanish because it had been given form both by ritual and by the warp itself. In secret forums that avoided the gaze of containment, the songs persisted in hushed, gilded versions. There were those who whispered that the fall had been not misfortune but revelation. They built altars and sang in languages that had once been banned. Some of these cults were small and furtive. Others grew into city-states that prospered by trade in the last traces of the old harmonics. Their patrons swore they had found a way to enjoy without being devoured. The rest of the galaxy watched them as one assesses a burn, with careful curiosity and an anxious hand hovering near a salve. The webway itself carried scars. Where once it had been a network of confidence, it now bore nodes that stuttered and bridged that would not be trusted without calibration. Long years were devoted to the painstaking sealing of corridors that had become dangerous. Craftsfolk and seers collaborated to create warding patterns designed to deflect the more insistent motifs that still lurked like ghosts in the currents. It was delicate work, a weave of engineering and prayer, and the successes were rarely complete. Some corridors could be fixed, some had to be abandoned. In their abandonment lay another sorrow. Parts of the Eldar's culture had to be left unvisited, memories put under lock, because the act of remembering the wrong thing was itself an invitation. Children born after the fall grew in a world of private contra-rituals. They learned in classrooms where teachers made toys that did not sing, where games emphasized endurance over immediate reward. They were schooled in the art of bearing discomfort and in the virtue of small, steady tasks. Yet even in such careful settings, old patterns whispered from corners. A neighbor's lullaby might carry a cadenced phrase that made the pupils look up and not know why. The danger of the old harmonics was not entirely external. It persisted in language and metaphor, in the casual sweetness people still used to light conversation. A single line of a song, repeated, could be a seed. There were places where the memory of the fall became an industry of caution. Guilds of healers and watchers offered training. How to calibrate a node safely, how to detect residues of the being in an artisan's work, how to counsel a family grieving a loved one lost to the call. These practices were in part commerce, in part service, and in part ritualized penance. The economies of entire regions shifted to support the slow rebuilding of civic capacity. Resources once used for crafting moments of exquisite pleasure were repurposed into stores and docks, into schools and watch houses. The map of priorities changed, and that change in itself was a measure of survival. Often, survival wore the guise of small, private kindnesses. A veteran who had once written songs taught a child to repair a simple harp. An exile taught a neighborhood how to prune a stubborn vine. People discovered that the act of teaching, the patient passing along of skill, was itself the truest form of re-enchantment. It was through these gestures, dull and ordinary and insistently human, that something like culture stitched itself back into being. The Eldar learned again the art of small economies, of doing what must be done, of savoring without letting savoring become a scaffold for appetite. Every so often, the old motifs would flare like embers in wind. A shard would be found under a floorboard, humming faintly. A once popular aria would be hummed in a market and catch in the throat of a passerby like a remembered ache. Such moments were dangerous and sacred in equal measure. They drew people into either curiosity or caution. Some preserved the memory of the flare as a lesson, to bury it, to break it, to sing new lines over it until the old music could no longer find purchase. Others kept pieces, secret talismans of a vanished night. The surviving materials became relics that some hoarded and some destroyed. Both acts were forms of meaning-making, to hold as a warning, to obliterate as an act of mercy for the living. Perhaps the most painful work survivors undertook was the naming of blame. Where responsibility could be ascribed, the Eldar argued and wept and legislated. In some places, seers who had been compromised were stripped of sight and given a life of simple tasks. In others, forgiveness was meted out slowly, in rituals that involved long hours of contrition. The reasons for the fall were debated as theology and as policy. Some insisted that it had been a failure of restraint. Others insisted that it was a failure of care, that in their rush to soothe trauma and to perfect pleasure, they had overlooked the architectural risk of appetite. The arguments were necessary, and they were not in themselves healing. There was, through all of this, an emergence of stories, tales told in low voices to remind listeners of how things could go wrong. They were not mere tall tales. They were warnings in the shape of fable, passed down to frighten and instruct. In these stories, a child is taught that even the most beautiful thing can have teeth. A song is sung of a fountain that sang so sweetly it made the town forget to harvest. Parents used these stories to teach caution without preaching. Storytellers crafted them with the delicate irony of a people who knew the price of being precise. Time did not undo the wound. It softened its edges. The immediate crises, the councils, the bombs, the smashed nodes, receded into a long history. The scarred webway routes were no longer daily conversation. The shrines were no longer sites of grief for most. New generations claimed their space and made new music that echoed with restraint. Yet the echo never truly faded. It lived in the way the Eldar now structured pleasure. Small, intermittent, deliberate. A laugh was allowed. A night of indulgence was permitted only as ceremonial exception rather than habitual law. And always, there was the knowledge that what had been birthed could, if fed in some way, reawaken. That knowledge hung like a weather system on the periphery of minds and shaped the instinct of caution. The elders kept watch not as tyrants, but as gardeners who understood that certain species of plant must be pruned and kept from seed if a field is to remain safe. They taught new rituals of interruption, a planned silence, a public day of unadorned work, a communal pruning of the gardens, a festival of plain foods eaten without music. These acts were small but cumulative. They created a new discipline that often proved more effective than law. At the center of the survivors' lives remained an uneasy question that had no clean answer. What to do with beauty? For the Eldar, beauty had been their compass. Now it had also been their fault line. To renounce beauty was to renounce their own soul. To loathe it was to make the past into something monstrous in a way that denied complexity. The solution they found was not the denial of beauty, but its translation into service. Beauty used to teach, to repair, to pass skill and wisdom, rather than to soothe appetite. Hands that once made objects for private rapture learned to make instruments of teaching. Songs that once elevated sensation were rewritten to hold pauses that taught patience. It was a hard and humble alchemy. If there is a final image to hold from this long unspooling, it is not grand nor epic in the heroic sense. It is of a small terrace at dawn, where an old farseer and a young apprentice stand together watching a simple ritual of pruning. The old one hums a half melody and the young one trims a branch, and the melody pauses and breathes. There is no rapture in that scene, only a chosen restraint, a decision made in countless small moments to choose the slow craft of living. It is an act of tenderness that will not be sung for centuries. It will be felt by the hands that do it and by the child who learns. And yet, the last truth in this tale is one that is almost unbearably quiet. The warp remembers. The beings that live in its current do not sleep as we do. They catalog patterns and store impressions like a mind that never forgets a face. The shape that was called into being by the Eldar's cultured hunger is not wholly gone. It listens, it learns, it waits for the note that will call it back. That waiting is patient and long and not easily thwarted by law or by smashing of crystals. It is woven into the fabric of memory itself. Hold, then, the whisper that closes this chapter. The survivors rebuild not because the world is safe, but because rebuilding itself is the only answer they know. They teach restraint as a form of love. They break and they make, and between those acts, they learn to live with the knowledge that the appetite they once fed may, in some future night, be called again by someone who does not remember the cost. It is a vigilance that rests in small deeds, in the pruning of a vine, the sealing of a vault, the patient telling of a story meant to make a child look up and say, "No." You will hear, if you stand very still and listen past the wind and the quiet, a distant thing, a soft vibration on the edge of dreams. It is not as loud as it once was. It is a shadow of sound that wants attention, that remembers the cadence of beauty and hunger blended. The Eldar have learned to live with it like a weather pattern, watchful, prepared, and never quite at ease. They are still watching. Even in the dark, they're waiting.